It was a warm and peaceful afternoon when Mr. Henry, a 70-year-old man with a gentle smile, left his small apartment to run errands in his neighborhood. His cane, worn from years of use, helped him navigate the uneven sidewalks. The sun was shining brightly, and there was a slight breeze in the air. Mr. Henry had lived in the neighborhood for most of his life, and he knew the area well. It was a routine walk, just like any other. As Mr. Henry slowly made his way down the street, he noticed the usual hustle and bustle of the busy city. People were walking by, some on their way to work, others heading home. Cars honked as they moved along the road, and the sound of children playing could be heard from a nearby park. It was an ordinary day, and everything felt normal. Mr. Henry wasn't in a rush, so he took his time, enjoying the simple pleasure of being out in the fresh air. However, things soon took an unexpected turn. As Mr. Henry approached a busy intersection, a police car pulled up beside him. The officer inside, a young man in his 30s, looked out the window and called out to Mr. Henry. The officer asked him to stop and come closer, his tone sharp and demanding. Mr. Henry, who had trouble hearing due to his age, didn't immediately respond. He was focused on crossing the street and didn't realize that the officer was talking to him. When he heard the officer's voice again, this time louder and more insistent, he slowly turned around. The officer's face showed impatience, his hand gripping the steering wheel as he repeated his command. "Stop right there," the officer yelled. "Come over here." Mr. Henry, startled and confused, made his way toward the officer's car. He leaned on his cane for support, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, officer," he said softly. "I didn't hear you the first time." The officer's expression hardened. He didn't seem to care about the misunderstanding. Instead, he began asking Mr. Henry a series of questions. "What are you doing out here? Why are you walking around with that cane? What's your business here?" Mr. Henry, taken aback by the officer's aggressive tone, tried to explain that he was simply out for a walk. He explained that the cane helped him because of his age and that he had no intention of causing any trouble. "I'm just getting some fresh air and going to the store," Mr. Henry replied, his voice calm but filled with uncertainty. But the officer wasn't satisfied with Mr. Henry's answer. Instead of listening to him, the officer began to accuse him of being suspicious. "You're walking around here like you're up to something," the officer said, his voice rising with anger. "You think I don't know what's going on? You're not fooling anyone." Mr. Henry felt a wave of confusion and fear wash over him. He didn't understand why the officer was treating him this way. He had done nothing wrong. But as the officer's anger grew, Mr. Henry began to feel a sense of unease. The officer stepped out of the car, approaching Mr. Henry in a threatening manner. "Do you want me to take you in?" the officer barked, his hand hovering near his belt. Mr. Henry froze, not knowing what to do. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's presence was overwhelming. The people walking by had started to notice the commotion, but no one seemed to stop or speak up. The moment felt tense and uncomfortable. Just as the officer was about to say something else, something strange happened. A familiar voice called out from across the street. "Hey, what's going on here?" It was a young woman, someone who had seen Mr. Henry in the neighborhood for years. She had witnessed the whole exchange and immediately stepped forward to speak out. She had always admired Mr. Henry for his kind nature, and she couldn't stand to see him treated this way. The officer paused, caught off guard by the woman's sudden intervention. For a moment, there was silence, and Mr. Henry stood still, unsure of what would happen next. His heart raced, and he gripped his cane even tighter, hoping that this uncomfortable situation would soon come to an end. In that brief moment, it seemed as though everything was at a standstill. The officer stood there, fuming, while the young woman continued to approach, ready to speak up on behalf of Mr. Henry. Something was about to change, but no one knew how the situation would unfold next. The young woman, who had been watching from the other side of the street, stepped forward with determination. She was about 30 years old, with short, curly hair, and a confident, calm demeanor. She had seen the officer stop Mr. Henry before, but she had never seen him act so aggressively. The officer had often passed by the elderly man without much interaction, but today, something was different. She could tell that the officer wasn't just questioning Mr. Henry out of curiosity. He was accusing him, and she could feel the tension in the air. "Excuse me, officer," she said firmly as she approached the officer and Mr. Henry. "Why are you treating this man like this? He hasn't done anything wrong. He's just trying to enjoy his day." The officer, momentarily caught off guard by the woman's presence, turned to face her. "Mind your business, lady," he said, his voice harsh. "I'm just doing my job. This man looks suspicious. I have every right to ask him questions." But the woman didn't back down. She knew that she had to stand up for Mr. Henry. "There's nothing suspicious about an elderly man walking with a cane," she responded, her voice steady. "He's not causing any harm, and he certainly doesn't deserve to be treated like this." The officer's expression grew angrier. "Stay out of this, or I'll have to arrest you too." Mr. Henry, who had been silently observing the exchange, felt a mix of fear and gratitude. He had never been in trouble with the law, and the officer's hostility was unsettling. But as he looked at the young woman, he felt a sense of relief. She had stepped in when no one else had, and he could see that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. The crowd that had gathered around them seemed to grow uncomfortable as the argument continued. Some people whispered to each other, while others simply watched the scene unfold. No one had intervened yet, but there was a growing sense of unease. The situation was getting out of hand, and Mr. Henry could feel the pressure mounting. "Officer, please," the woman continued, her voice softening but still firm. "He's an elderly man. He can't move as quickly as you want him to. He's not a threat. You don't need to treat him this way." The officer took a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. It was clear that he didn't appreciate being challenged in front of others, but something in the woman's words made him pause. For a moment, he seemed to reconsider his actions. The tension between the officer, the woman, and Mr. Henry lingered in the air. But just as the officer was about to say something, a car pulled up beside them, and a familiar face emerged. It was Mr. Henry's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Lawson. She was a middle-aged woman who had known Mr. Henry for years, and she had seen him walk down the street countless times. She had always admired his gentle nature and the way he cared for his neighbors. When she saw what was happening, she immediately parked her car and rushed over. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Lawson asked, looking from the officer to Mr. Henry. "Why is he on the ground?" The officer, still standing tall, turned to her. "This man is being uncooperative," he said, his voice still filled with frustration. "He's resisting questioning." Mrs. Lawson, who had always been an advocate for fairness, crossed her arms. "I don't see him resisting. I see a man who's been stopped without cause. He's just out for a walk. You're the one causing trouble here." The officer glared at her, but Mrs. Lawson stood her ground. The crowd that had been quietly observing now started to murmur among themselves, and a few people even pulled out their phones to record the situation. The pressure on the officer was growing, and he could feel it. He took another deep breath, and for a moment, he seemed to reconsider his approach. "You're making a mistake," the woman said to the officer, her voice still calm but firm. "You need to let him go." The officer hesitated. His eyes darted from the woman to Mr. Henry, who was still sitting on the ground, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Slowly, the officer backed away, his shoulders slumping as if realizing the situation had gotten out of hand. For a moment, everything was still. The woman, Mr. Henry, Mrs. Lawson, and the small crowd watched the officer. No one said a word. Finally, the officer mumbled something under his breath and turned away, heading back to his police car. "I don't need to be here," he muttered. As he drove off, the crowd slowly began to disperse, and the tension in the air started to fade. The woman, Mrs. Lawson, and Mr. Henry exchanged looks of relief. The situation had been tense, but thanks to the courage of the two women who stepped in, Mr. Henry was no longer under threat. He slowly stood up, his hands shaking slightly, and adjusted his cane. The day after the incident with the officer, Mr. Henry still felt shaken. He had never imagined that something as simple as taking a walk could lead to such a frightening confrontation. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, wondering if he had done something wrong, or if he could have handled the situation differently. But despite his worries, he couldn't stop thinking about the young woman who had stepped in to help him. She had saved him from an unfair situation, and he couldn't be more grateful. Meanwhile, the woman who had intervened was also reflecting on the event. Her name was Tanya, and she had lived in the same neighborhood as Mr. Henry for many years. She had seen him walking down the street often, always with a smile and kind words for everyone he passed. But when she witnessed the officer's harsh treatment of him, something inside her told her she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Tanya knew that sometimes people are hesitant to speak up, especially when it involves authority figures. But she felt an instinctive urge to protect Mr. Henry. She could see the fear in his eyes, and that was enough to push her into action. Tanya had always been someone who believed in standing up for others, especially when they couldn't defend themselves. She had grown up in a family that valued kindness and fairness, and she knew this was a moment when her values needed to come to life. That afternoon, Tanya decided to visit Mr. Henry at his apartment. She knocked on the door and waited, hoping he would be open to talking about the event. When he answered, his face showed signs of distress, but there was also a soft smile when he recognized her. "Good afternoon, Tanya," Mr. Henry greeted her kindly, but his voice was tinged with a hint of nervousness. Tanya smiled back. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to check on you after everything that happened yesterday. Are you doing okay?" Mr. Henry's expression softened, and he invited her inside. They sat down at his kitchen table, and for the next few minutes, Mr. Henry explained how he had been feeling since the confrontation. He told Tanya about his long walks around the neighborhood, the comfort they gave him, and how everything had felt so peaceful before the officer stopped him. The incident had left him feeling vulnerable, especially since he didn't expect to be treated that way by someone who was supposed to protect the community. Tanya listened carefully, her heart heavy with empathy. "I can only imagine how difficult it must have been for you," she said. "But I want you to know that what happened wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Henry nodded, grateful for her understanding. "It's just that sometimes it feels like I don't belong. Like because of my age and my cane, people look at me differently. I've always tried to stay out of trouble and live quietly, but it seems like the world is changing in ways I don't always understand." Tanya placed a reassuring hand on his. "You belong, Mr. Henry. And there are people, like me and others, who care about you. You don't have to be afraid." The words were comforting, but Tanya knew they could do more. She decided that it was time to take action. The following day, Tanya spoke to a few neighbors and shared what had happened to Mr. Henry. Many of them were shocked by the officer's behavior. They had all seen Mr. Henry as a kind and gentle person who would never cause trouble. Tanya knew that if the community came together and voiced their support for Mr. Henry, they could send a powerful message that the actions of one officer didn't represent the values they all held dear. Word quickly spread, and soon a group of residents gathered in front of the community center, including Mrs. Lawson, who had been there when Mr. Henry was stopped. They stood together, holding signs that read "Support our neighbors" and "Justice for Mr. Henry." Tanya was proud to see so many people, young and old, standing up for what was right. A few of the local news outlets caught wind of the event and arrived to speak with the residents. Tanya stood with Mr. Henry as reporters approached. She could see that he was still hesitant, but his face showed gratitude. It was clear that the support from his neighbors was helping him heal, even if only a little at a time. "I want people to understand," Tanya told the reporters, "that no one should be treated like that, no matter their age or their appearance." Mr. Henry, though still overwhelmed by the attention, spoke to the reporters. "I never wanted any of this," he said quietly, "but I'm grateful for all the people who've stood by me. I never thought people would care this much." As the gathering ended, the group of neighbors walked together, showing their solidarity with Mr. Henry. They knew the journey wasn't over, but it was a start. Mr. Henry had a long road to recovery, but with the support of his community, he began to feel more hopeful. After the gathering in support of Mr. Henry, things began to change. The neighborhood, once quiet and disconnected, had found its voice. The small community that had come together in the wake of the troubling incident was more united than ever before. It wasn't just about standing up for Mr. Henry anymore. It had become a larger movement to make sure that everyone in the community, no matter their age or background, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Tanya continued to visit Mr. Henry every few days, checking in on him and making sure he felt supported. The elderly man had always been a private person, but with the overwhelming support from his neighbors, he began to feel more at ease. The fear he had once felt had started to fade, replaced with a newfound sense of strength. He realized that he wasn't alone, that there were people around him who truly cared about his well-being. One afternoon, Tanya brought some of the neighbors to visit Mr. Henry. As they sat in his living room, sipping tea and chatting, Tanya couldn't help but notice the shift in Mr. Henry's mood. He was no longer withdrawn but engaged and smiling. The kindness and care he had received from the community had made all the difference. "Thank you all for everything," Mr. Henry said with gratitude. "I've never felt this much support in my life. It means more to me than words can express." Tanya smiled warmly, placing a hand on his. "You don't have to thank us, Mr. Henry. We're just doing what's right." But as much as things seemed to improve, the shadow of the officers' actions still loomed over them. Tanya knew that it wasn't just enough for the community to stand together in support of Mr. Henry. They needed to ensure that what had happened was addressed, and that it never happened again. That's when Tanya reached out to a local civil rights group. She shared the story of Mr. Henry's experience, and soon enough, they were involved in the effort to make sure the officer's behavior was properly investigated. The group began advocating for Mr. Henry, urging the local authorities to review the officer's actions and ensure that he was held accountable. Tanya knew that this would be a long and challenging road, but she was determined to see it through for Mr. Henry's sake, and for the sake of others who might suffer the same treatment in the future. Meanwhile, the rest of the community rallied behind the cause. Word spread about the group's involvement, and soon, more people joined in the effort. The neighborhood's sense of unity only grew stronger. People who had never spoken to each other before now found common ground, united by a shared belief in justice and respect for all individuals. They organized meetings to discuss what steps they could take next, and the conversations were filled with passion and determination. People wanted to make sure that their neighborhood was a place where everyone felt safe, respected, and valued. One evening, Tanya, Mrs. Lawson, and a few others met with the civil rights group to discuss how they could push for change. Tanya was nervous about what they could achieve, but she was also proud of how far they had come. The conversation was focused on writing letters to local officials, gathering signatures for petitions, and even organizing a peaceful demonstration to raise awareness of the issue. Tanya could feel the determination in the room, and it inspired her to keep fighting. A few weeks later, the group successfully got a meeting with the city council. Tanya, along with Mr. Henry and some of the other community members, stood before the council members to tell their story. They explained how the officer's actions had harmed Mr. Henry and how the community had come together to support him. They made it clear that this wasn't just about one person. It was about the values the entire neighborhood held dear: respect, fairness, and equality. After the meeting, Tanya felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet, but the community had made its voice heard. She knew that, with continued effort and support, they could make sure that justice was served. And while the path ahead would be long, Tanya, Mr. Henry, and the rest of the neighborhood were ready to face it together. As the days went by, Tanya visited Mr. Henry more frequently. Their bond had grown stronger, and she had become more than just a neighbor. She had become a friend. They would sit together, reminiscing about the past and talking about the future, laughing and sharing stories. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Henry felt truly at peace. He knew that no matter what happened, he had the support of his community, and that was something that could never be taken away from him. As weeks passed, the community's efforts to support Mr. Henry grew stronger. The letters had been written, the petitions were signed, and the peaceful demonstration was planned for the coming weekend. The unity within the neighborhood was something Mr. Henry had never experienced in his life. He had always felt like a quiet observer, someone who kept to himself and rarely asked for help. But now he realized that he was part of something bigger, something that could change not only his life, but also the future of the entire community. Tanya continued to visit him regularly, offering support and encouragement. They would often sit on his porch, chatting about everything from the weather to the future. The discussions were always filled with warmth, and for the first time in a long time, Mr. Henry felt like he was truly part of something positive. One afternoon, as Tanya was preparing for the demonstration, she was approached by a group of local students. They had heard about what had happened to Mr. Henry and wanted to get involved. "We want to help," one of the students said. "We can hand out flyers, talk to people, and make sure everyone knows about the demonstration." Tanya was taken aback by their eagerness. It wasn't every day that young people took such an active interest in social justice, but the energy of the students reminded her of how important it was to engage everyone in the fight for what's right. "Thank you," Tanya replied with a smile. "We'll need all the help we can get." The night before the demonstration, Mr. Henry couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the future, but also with gratitude for everything that had come together in such a short time. He had never expected to be the center of attention, but now he was proud to stand with his neighbors and friends. They weren't just fighting for him, they were fighting for a better world for everyone. The next day, the community gathered in front of the local community center. People of all ages stood together, holding signs and chanting slogans that promoted equality and justice. Tanya, along with Mrs. Lawson, organized the event, making sure everyone knew what the purpose was: to show solidarity for Mr. Henry and to demand accountability for the officer's actions. The police department had promised to review the incident, but the community knew that their voices would be the driving force for real change. Mr. Henry stood at the front of the crowd, his cane by his side. He had never been a man of many words, but today he felt strong. He had the support of the people around him, and that gave him the courage to speak up. When it was his turn to address the crowd, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you all for being here today," Mr. Henry began. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet emotion behind his words. "I never thought that something like this would happen to me, but because of all of you, I feel like I'm not alone. This is about more than just me. It's about making sure that we all get treated with respect, no matter who we are or where we come from." The crowd applauded, and Mr. Henry felt a rush of warmth and pride. He could see the faces of the people who had stood by him every step of the way. He knew that no matter what happened next, the community had come together to stand for what was right. As the demonstration continued, people shared their stories of injustice and inequality. The energy in the air was filled with determination. They weren't just protesting. They were showing the world that they would no longer stand by in silence. They would no longer let unfair treatment go unnoticed. Their voices had power, and together, they were making sure that power was heard. The local news stations arrived, capturing the event and broadcasting it to a wider audience. Tanya spoke to a reporter, explaining why the demonstration was so important. "It's about standing up for justice," she said. "It's about making sure that every person, no matter their age, their race, or their background, is treated with dignity." Mr. Henry's story is just one example of the kind of injustice that happens every day, and we won't let it continue. As the event came to an end, Tanya stood by Mr. Henry, watching as people slowly left, still talking among themselves about the importance of what they had done. It had been a peaceful, powerful day, and she knew it was just the beginning. The change they were fighting for wasn't going to come overnight, but with the community's continued efforts, Tanya believed they would succeed. Mr. Henry, who had once felt like he was invisible, now understood that his story could make a difference. His quiet strength had inspired others, and together with the support of his neighbors, they had shown that change was possible. It wasn't just about one man's struggle, it was about standing together for what was right, and ensuring that no one was ever made to feel less than again. The police department had promised to review the officers' actions, but Tanya, Mrs. Lawson, and other community leaders knew that they couldn't just wait around for change to happen. They had to keep pushing, keep advocating, and keep raising their voices until justice was truly served. Tanya felt a sense of urgency. Every day, more and more people were standing up to say that this wasn't just about Mr. Henry. It was about holding the police accountable and ensuring that everyone, regardless of who they were, would be treated fairly. The group had decided to meet regularly to discuss their next steps. Tanya arranged a meeting at the community center, where neighbors gathered to share their thoughts and plan their next actions. Mr. Henry, while still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention, continued to show up to every meeting. He was no longer the quiet man who kept to himself. He had become an important voice in the movement for justice. During one of these meetings, a local reporter attended to cover the story. Tanya stood up to speak about the next phase of their efforts. "We've made a difference already, but this fight isn't over," she said, looking out at the group of neighbors, many of whom had become close friends over the past few weeks. "The officers' actions still need to be addressed. We need to keep the pressure on." Mrs. Lawson added, "We've come together as a community to make sure that no one is treated unfairly. We can't stop now. This is about standing up for what's right. It's about ensuring justice, not just for Mr. Henry, but for everyone who has faced mistreatment." Everyone in the room nodded in agreement, feeling a shared sense of determination. Tanya knew that their unity was their strength, and with each passing day, their voices grew louder. They were no longer just a small group of concerned citizens. They were a movement, and they had the power to bring about change. As the investigation into the officers' actions continued, Tanya, Mr. Henry, and the rest of the community kept their focus on the goal. They continued writing letters, gathering more signatures, and speaking out in local forums about the importance of police accountability and the need for fair treatment for all. They knew that change was often slow, but they were committed to the long road ahead. One evening, Tanya received a phone call that would change everything. It was from the city's police chief. "Tanya," the chief said, his voice firm but respectful, "we've completed the internal investigation regarding the incident with Mr. Henry. The officer in question has been placed on administrative leave while we review his actions more thoroughly. I want to assure you that we take this matter seriously." Tanya felt a rush of relief and disbelief. It wasn't the final answer, but it was a start. The officer was being held accountable, and the investigation was moving forward. She shared the news with Mr. Henry, who was deeply touched by how much the community had supported him. It was proof that their efforts weren't in vain. The following week, the police department held a public meeting to discuss the findings of the investigation. Tanya, Mr. Henry, and many others from the neighborhood attended, eager to hear what would be said. The meeting room was filled with concerned citizens, all watching as the police chief addressed the crowd. "The officer involved has been placed on leave pending further review," the police chief said. "We are committed to ensuring that all members of this community are treated with respect and dignity. We will continue to evaluate how we can improve our training and policies to prevent this kind of incident from happening again." The crowd responded with applause, but Tanya and Mr. Henry knew that this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, but the steps that had been taken were a clear indication that the community's voices had been heard. In the weeks that followed, the City Council began drafting new policies aimed at improving police conduct and increasing transparency within the force. While these changes didn't erase the pain of the past, they were a sign of progress. Mr. Henry, who had once felt invisible, now felt a sense of empowerment. His community had fought for him, and together, they had made a difference. Tanya visited Mr. Henry regularly, and each time they sat together, he expressed his gratitude. "I never thought I'd be in the middle of something like this," he said. "But with all the support from everyone, I feel stronger. I feel like I've found my voice." Tanya smiled. "You've always had your voice, Mr. Henry. Now, the world is finally listening." It was clear that the journey wasn't over, but the victory they had achieved together, standing up for what was right, supporting one another, and demanding justice, was something no one could ever take away. And with that, the community moved forward, stronger than ever before. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood remained united. More people started getting involved in the cause. The letters and petitions kept flowing, and the calls for better police training and accountability grew louder. But now, the momentum was different. It wasn't just about one person. It was about everyone who had been affected by unfair treatment, and the entire community was behind the effort. One morning, Tanya received a call from the local news station. They'd wanted to interview her about the progress that had been made since the demonstration. Tanya had been an active voice in the community, and the station believed her story could inspire others to take a stand in their own neighborhoods. She agreed to the interview, feeling a mix of excitement and responsibility. That afternoon, Tanya and Mr. Henry stood in front of the camera, ready to share their journey with the world. Tanya spoke about the community's efforts to support Mr. Henry, how they had come together to raise awareness, and how they had been able to keep the pressure on the police department to take action. "We weren't just fighting for one man," Tanya said during the interview. "We were fighting for fairness, respect, and accountability. We wanted to make sure that this didn't happen to anyone else, and that our community stood together to make sure people like Mr. Henry, people who may not always have a voice, could be heard." Mr. Henry sat beside her, his cane resting on the ground next to him. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he spoke honestly about how the support from his neighbors had changed his life. "I never expected this kind of attention," he said, his voice steady. "But what I've learned is that when people care about each other, they can do amazing things. This community has shown me what real support looks like, and I'm grateful for it." The interview was broadcast on the local news, and soon, the story began to spread beyond their neighborhood. People from different parts of the city reached out to offer their support, and many asked how they could help bring about similar changes in their own communities. Tanya, Mr. Henry, and their neighbors felt proud knowing that their fight for justice had inspired others to take action. As the investigation into the officers' behavior continued, the police department announced that they would be implementing new policies to address issues of racial bias and to improve the way officers interacted with the community. While the officer involved in Mr. Henry's case had not yet been fired, there were clear signs that change was underway. The department promised to increase transparency and to create training programs that would focus on understanding and addressing racial profiling. For Tanya, Mrs. Lawson, and all the people who had been part of the movement, it felt like a turning point. The community's efforts had led to real change, but there was still work to be done. They knew they couldn't stop now. They would continue advocating for fairness and equality, making sure that every person in their community, regardless of their race, age, or background, was treated with the respect they deserved. One day, Tanya and Mr. Henry sat down together to reflect on everything that had happened. The peaceful demonstration, the letters, the meetings, they had all led to something bigger than they had ever imagined. Tanya smiled as she looked at Mr. Henry. "You know," she said, "you may have started as someone who just wanted to take a walk, but now you've helped change a whole community." Mr. Henry chuckled, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I never expected this to happen," he said, "but I'm glad it did. I've learned that you can't just sit back and hope for things to change. You have to take action." Tanya nodded in agreement. "That's the truth. And now we have a stronger community than ever. We've shown that when people stand together, there's nothing they can't do." The work wasn't over, but the people in this community knew they had made a difference. They had turned a difficult situation into an opportunity for growth, change, and unity. Mr. Henry, once feeling isolated and unheard, now felt empowered. And the people who had rallied behind him felt a deep sense of pride. They had created a new beginning for their neighborhood, one where everyone, no matter their circumstances, could feel supported, valued, and heard. As the sun set on another peaceful evening, Tanya and Mr. Henry stood together on his porch, looking out at the neighborhood. It was a quiet moment, but it was full of hope. They had fought for justice, and together they had won. Now it was time to continue that work, ensuring that the changes they had started would last for future generations. And so, the community moved forward, stronger, united, and ready to face whatever challenges came next, knowing that together, they could accomplish anything.